Ryan Crocker is Dean and Executive Professor at the George Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, where he holds the Edward and Howard Cruz Endowed Chair. He held the James Schlesinger Distinguished Visiting Professor Chair at the University of Virginia, and he was the first Kissinger Senior Fellow at Yale University. Apparently those two appointments overlapped somewhat, and because, as some people know, that Kissinger and Schlesinger were not on speaking terms, we had to get permission for the starting time. Do I have that right? Great story, great story. Typical Washington, large-minded people. Ambassador Crocker retired from the Foreign Service in 2009 after a career of over 37 years. He tried to retire. He was recalled to active duty by President Obama to serve as U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, where he served in 2011 and 2012. That was his sixth assignment as a U.S. Ambassador. He served previous to that in Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Lebanon. There's a little murmuring on the front row here. All easy places. In a very sobering note, it was pointed out earlier today, and I hope it's accurate, and I apologize if I'm repeating, but I'm pretty sure it's accurate, that more U.S. ambassadors have lost their lives in the line of duty since World War II than general officers in the military service. And in 3 of the 6 places where Ambassador Crocker served, U.S. ambassadors gave their lives prior to his assignments. And his courage is reflected in some of what I'm about to tell you about. He was born in Spokane, Washington. He grew up in an Air Force family, attending schools in Morocco, Canada, and Turkey, as well as the U.S. His B.A. in English is from Whitman College in Washington, where he also received an honorary Doctor of Laws degree. Ambassador Crocker received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian award this country offers. He also received these awards: the Veteran of Foreign Wars Dwight D. Eisenhower Award, the Presidential Distinguished and Meritorious Service Awards, the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award, the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Civilian Service and Distinguished Public Service, the Award for Valor, and one that caught my attention as well, the American Foreign Service Association Rivkin Award for Creative Dissent. He received the National Clandestine Services Donovan Award and also the Director of Central Intelligence's Director's Award. In 2011, he was awarded the Marshall Award by the Association of the United States Army. In 2002, he had been sent after the operations in Afghanistan following 9/11 to reopen the U.S. Embassy in Afghanistan. And thereafter, he received the Robert C. Frazier Memorial Award for exceptional courage and leadership in Afghanistan. In September 2004, he was awarded by President Bush the personal rank of Career Ambassador, the highest award, the highest rank that a Foreign Service officer can achieve. In 2009, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton established the Ryan C. Crocker Award for Outstanding Achievement in Expeditionary Diplomacy. And perhaps saving the best for last, in 2012, Ambassador Crocker was named an honorary Marine. 75 people, he became the 75th person in the history of the United States to be so designated as an honorary Marine. The Marines whom he's served with these 40 plus years in his career have learned to respect him. I commend to you one of the truly great servants of my generation, of our generation, and look forward to him helping us in a presidential election year do something that is quite difficult, to understand some of the complexity and the challenge, but the worthwhileness of engaging the challenge of leadership in the world, and particularly in the Middle East. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Ryan Crocker.
Thank you, Fred, for that generous introduction. It does remind me uncomfortably that Unlike the students in the room, I have much more of a past than I do a future. So, it is the case, as Fred laid out, that I did serve 6 times as ambassador in 6 places that no sane person would spend a weekend in. Which underscores the one great quality I brought to my career in the Foreign Service. It's my innate expendability. This goes back to George H.W. Bush, whose ambassador I was in Lebanon from 1990 to 1993. The embassy had actually been closed for almost a year and a half before I went in. Been closed because a Lebanese militia leader was threatening to overrun the compound, sort of hand us a Tehran-style hostage situation. So they pulled out the entire embassy staff. And there was some conversation around the president that as we were moving towards the Desert Storm, the liberation of Kuwait, we really needed to be on the ground in Beirut. So after some conversation, it was decided that they should send me. And the way it was related to me is, well, let's send Crocker. If it works, that's great. And if it doesn't work, no great loss. And then they repeated it and repeated it and repeated it. Thank you, Dr. Williams and the Wheatley Institution for inviting me here. It's a real privilege and an honor to be at Brigham Young University. I'm actually kind of relieved. I wasn't sure not only that I would ever be invited here, that I'd be allowed on campus because, as Fred noted, I am the Dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service, and in 2012, we stole a truly great professor from you, Valerie Hudson. So I'm just waiting, to get dry gulched on my my way to the car after the lecture. But in addition to poaching your faculty, and I met some really great ones today. You'll be hearing from me. There is a connection between Brigham Young and A&M, the Bush School in particular. A number of Brigham Young graduates have come to us. We have a master's-only program, no undergrads, no PhDs. And it's all in our name. It's not a school of public affairs or public policy. It's public service. So young men and women come to us because they know who they are. Bless all of you who teach undergraduates. I'm so glad I don't have to help the 18 to 21-year-old set discover who they are. They know what they want to do. They want to serve our great nation at the local, the state, or the federal level, or in nonprofits and NGOs. And again, our guiding principle comes from the 41st President of the United States. It is the belief that public service is a noble calling. And this university, which is about so many things, perhaps most profoundly is about service. So a pitch to the students in the audience, do think of the Bush School if you think you might be heading into a career in public service. I would also ask you to think of the Foreign Service. Brigham Young has sent to the State Department some of our finest Foreign Service officers. We were just reflecting on 3 currently serving ambassadors who are all Brigham Young graduates. Ambassador Steve Beecroft in Cairo, and Mrs. Beecroft is here tonight. Ambassador Matt Tueller, our ambassador to Yemen, and Ambassador Deborah Jones, our ambassador to Libya, and it speaks all you would want to hear about them and about the great university that educated them, that two of those three are ambassadors to countries that are in such turmoil. They are not currently at their post, they're in neighboring countries. And Egypt is definitely having its moments as well. So this university produces selfless public servants who will go to the hard places, do the hard things, expect no reward for doing it. It is a spirit of service, and I would encourage current students to think of the Foreign Service as you make your post-graduation career plans. What I'm going to do is be relatively brief here and just lay out some organizing concepts that I've found helpful in trying to understand the unprecedented tumult of the broader Middle East. First, let me define my terms. When I say broader Middle East, it's that swath of land from Morocco on the Atlantic coast of North Africa, all the way through North Africa, into the countries of the Levant. That's Israel, Jordan, the Palestinian territories, Syria and Lebanon, the Arabian Peninsula, anchored by Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and then the non-Arab countries to the east, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Different languages, different cultures, different religions, but they all share a roughly similar worldview that is formed in no small part by the fact that every one of those countries, with the exception of the interior of Yemen and Saudi Arabia, every one of those countries has been occupied by one or more Western powers since Napoleon Bonaparte went into Egypt in 1798. And I'll come back to this. It is, we don't think of the Middle East as occupied countries. We don't see ourselves as occupiers. That's not how Middle Easterners view it. They very much see us in that light. And it affects what we're dealing with today. The modern Middle East is roughly 100 years old. It dates back to the treaties of Versailles and Sèvres after World War I that literally drew the lines on the map that still exist today. In that 100 years, we have never seen a more chaotic and turbulent time than we see today. We're used to a Middle East where there are revolutions and coups and governments are overthrown. What we're seeing now is something far starker. We are seeing states fail, countries collapse. Syria, a completely failed state. Libya, Yemen, all completely failed states. And Iraq is right on the edge, maybe going over it. And Afghanistan will be there too if we decide we're tired of it all and are going to pull out the last of our troops. Now, with the failure of states, we're seeing something else that is quite disturbing. It's the rise of non-state actors. They come in several categories. There are those that are state-sponsored. That would be, for example, Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militia that has done so much harm in that country to Israel and now in Syria. And then there are the actors who don't have state sponsorship, most prominently Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. It's a new phenomenon in the Middle East, and it is no longer just restricted to the Middle East. You also have Shabab in Somalia, Boko Haram, in Northwest Africa. So states fail, non-state actors rise. It is a new regional disorder, very grave in its implications for security there and throughout the world, including in our own country. With the various conflicts we see in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, there is an overarching construct that I call the Middle East Cold War. And its two principal protagonists, not the US and Russia, Saudi Arabia and Iran. The citadel of Shia Islam versus the citadel of Sunni Islam, which means that these conflicts around the region are increasingly denominated in sectarian terms. There has been a tendency in this country to kind of leap past that to say, well, it's always been a religious war, it's gone on for 1,500 years, it'll go on for another 1,500 years, and there's nothing we can do about it. Not exactly. I mean, at the time of my first tour in the Foreign Service, which was in the Iran of the Shah, we were relying post-Vietnam on a sort of a twin pillar of Gulf security. And those two pillars were Saudi Arabia and Iran, working very closely with us, working very closely with each other. Didn't matter that one was Sunni and the other was Shia. To the extent that the Shah sent a brigade to the Arabian Peninsula to help the Sultan of Oman put down a communist-backed insurrection. And that was perfectly fine with the Saudis. In fact, the Saudis were part of the coordination to get the Iranians there. Just worth bearing in mind, this is not a millennial struggle between Shia and Sunni. Sectarian differences have always been there, virtually since the dawn of Islam, but very rarely have they been expressed in violent terms. I would just give you another example, particularly as we worry about, if you will, Islamic terrorism. Well, there's something inherent in Islam that tends to violence, if not outright terror, and it's always been that way. Well, I'm old enough to remember another era of Middle Eastern terror. This was in the late 60s and through the decade of the 70s. This was Palestinian terror. Palestinian groups did a whole lot of damage in Israel and elsewhere. They assassinated one of my predecessors as ambassador to Lebanon, and two other senior diplomats in the Sudan. Were they Islamic fanatics? Well, the most lethal group was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It was headed by George Habash. He was a Christian. The ideology was not only not Islamic, it was atheistic, as was the ideology of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, also headed by a Christian. So again, it helps to understand something of the history and the attendant complexity of this region, its alliances, its ideologies, its purposes. It is way more complicated than the broad brush strokes that paint this as an irresolvable religious struggle or an unending wave of Islamic terrorism. We do ourselves a disservice and a danger by thinking in those overly simplistic terms. So what is going on that has caused states to fail, has caused non-state actors to rise? The organizing principle that I have found to be the most useful, the thing I look at the most closely is governance, or the failure of governance. The Middle East has seen a chronic failure of governance, the failure to establish a consistent rule of law that applies to all, the failure to establish stable institutions that look to the interests of all of the governed. I describe it as a succession of failed isms. You can start in this 100-year period, you can start with the failure of colonialism and imperialism. After World War I, the French and the British ran most of the Middle East. What they did not do was spend a lot of time helping to develop indigenous institutions that had legitimacy in the eyes of their own people. Monarchism in the central Middle Eastern countries of Egypt and Iraq also failed. It gave way to yet another ism, Arab nationalism. Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, the most famous example. It derived its legitimacy through confrontation with Israel. But it did not, Arab nationalism made no particular effort to establish real legitimacy, again, by developing institutions and codifying and enforcing a consistent rule of law. Other isms also failed: Arab socialism, Baathism, communism, just undiluted authoritarianism. They all failed and gave way to another ism. Now we have, if you will, Islamism. So when I ask myself how enduring is Islamic State, I don't think that much in terms of their military capabilities. I think in terms of their governance. They benefited from having an incredibly low bar when they moved into parts of Syria and Iraq. The good governance as practiced by Bashar al-Assad or the Iraqi regime, not the kind of thing you want to hold up as a great example of state building. And indeed, Islamic State, they knew this. They may be evil, but they're not stupid. So they made an effort to establish very brutal but consistent and predictable justice. That if you did X, Y was going to happen to you 10 times out of 10. Not Z or not nothing, Y. For people with memories of totally arbitrary and capricious justice, if you can even call it that, that was a step forward. But what we've seen lately as the Islamic State is hurting for revenues is the establishment of really extortionate taxes. All taxes are extortionate. April 15th is coming, folks. But, we pay our taxes and we actually get services. People under Islamic State pay taxes and they get nothing. So I would predict to you that the Islamic State will fall apart at some point, not because of the use of American military force, but because they will fail as all their predecessors have failed to provide good governance. Don't feel good about that. There is no such thing as a vacuum, not in nature and certainly not in the Middle East. Something else we can't even imagine will rise in its place. And it is not going to be the Syrian and Iraqi Boy Scouts. It's going to be something pretty awful. And that takes me to us, the U.S. The U.S. has had about a 70-year history in the Middle East. It goes back basically to the end of World War II. Before then, we weren't there. A little bit of oil stuff in Saudi Arabia, We did some great works with education, American University of Beirut, American University of Cairo, medical missionaries throughout the region, but politically we weren't there. That was a European thing. 1945 changed that. The British and the French were bled white. They could not play their traditional role, and you had an ascendant Soviet Union. And basically, Churchill said to us, you better step up or the Soviets are going to step in. So we came to the Middle East basically as a Cold War theater and have been prominently engaged ever since. Sometimes that engagement has been positive and constructive. I am the dean of the George H.W. Bush School, and I am reminded that this month is the 25th anniversary of the liberation of Kuwait by the broadest international coalition since World War II. That was assembled by President Bush and Secretary Baker. That not only brought in our traditional European allies, we actually persuaded Egypt and even Syria to send each an armored division to Saudi Arabia as part of that effort. It was a magnificent achievement. Some of our other achievements have not been so magnificent. I was in Beirut when we kind of thought it would be a good idea if the Israelis invaded Lebanon and got rid of the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1982. You could argue that. I mean, Palestinian terrorism had killed a lot of Israelis and a lot of Americans, destabilized Jordan, the list goes on. So sure, it's a good idea, except it wasn't. Again, I was there. The Israelis pretty much got rid of the PLO, but they created the conditions that led to the rise of something far worse, and that was Hezbollah. And it really was worse. I met last night in Phoenix an old friend. He's now a Scottsdale police officer. He was a Marine sergeant in Beirut with me in the early 80s. We went through the bombing of the embassy in April of '83 together, obviously both surviving it. A lot of others didn't. It was the worst single attack ever on a U.S. diplomatic facility. And it was done by Hezbollah with Syrian and Iranian support. 6 months later, it got even worse. October 1983, the bombing of the Marine barracks, 244 dead. So we traded the PLO, who could kill us in ones or twos, and got in exchange a mass murder machine that could kill us by the hundreds. So why do I tell you this? Because it illustrates one of the very few things I learned in the Middle East over the years. And I'm going to tell you everything I learned. Before you panic and start running for the exits, let me assure you, it's only two things. The first one is be careful what you get into. That interventions, particularly military interventions in the volatile Middle East, can have extraordinary unintended consequences, not of the third and fourth order, but the 30th and 40th order that you cannot begin to predict, let alone plan for. And Beirut taught me that lesson 35 years ago, roughly. But we're not good at absorbing lessons. So, in 2002, the American people basically voted to have a big old war in Iraq through the congressional elections that year. And we did have a big old war in Iraq. Who could quibble with getting rid of a dictator who had invaded two of his neighbors and would invade a third if he got his hands on the wherewithal to do it? Again, be careful what you get into. The 30th and 40th order consequences, unimaginable. The the rise of sectarian strife as larger identities melted away, the loss of almost 4,500 American servicemen and women, of billions and billions of dollars. We got it stabilized on my watch, 2007, 2008, 2009. The violence subsided. Political agreements were reached among Sunni, Shia, and Kurds. There was a real national unity government. Iraq actually looked like it had a chance. But then we got tired of it. We decided we didn't want to be there anymore. The president was elected to end wars, not perpetuate them. Time to bring the troops home. But here's what happens. You don't end a war by withdrawing your forces. You simply leave the battle space to your adversaries. So from an Iraq in which we saw reasonable stability and the prospect for more, in which our presence was considered a positive element and helped them make the compromises they couldn't come to on their own, we pulled out in 2011. And how is Iraq occupied today? By Iranians, by extremist Shia militias whose leaders have murdered American service members, and by Islamic State. You know, it exceeds my worst nightmares from the time I left in 2009. So that's the second thing I learned. Be careful getting in. Be just as careful about what you propose to get out of. That disengagement can have consequences as great or greater than your original intervention. And I would suggest to you in Iraq, we kind of blew it on both. We weren't careful getting into it, even though we had the lesson of Lebanon, and we weren't careful getting out of it. That sets the stage for today, and I'll just conclude with this. If this is the most chaotic and turbulent the Middle East has ever been, this is a moment in which the U.S. is more disengaged from the area than it has been in the 70 years of our involvement there. I was out in Lebanon just before Christmas. The universal perception is the United States, at best, has just checked out. We're not involved anymore. At worst, that we're actually in collusion with the Iranians, with Hezbollah, with Assad, and with the Russians. And events like today, in which Secretary Kerry is meeting Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in Munich, how appropriate. Remember Neville Chamberlain in Munich? It's fosters that impression that we're not confronting the Russians, we're colluding with them as they work with Assad to massacre Syrian civilians by the tens of thousands. So the pendulum swung one way to an intervention in 2003 that led to a chain of unintended consequences, and then it swung the other way. We're done here, we're out, it's not our problem. Except it is. The Islamic State is most definitely our problem. A flood of refugees greater than at any time since World War II, although we may shut our doors to it, it's our problem because it's a global problem. So in an election year, as Fred so helpfully reminds us that we are in, my plea for whoever is going to be our next president is pretty simple. Engage. Be involved in the Middle East. And I don't mean sending in the 82nd Airborne again. I mean sending in, not putting boots on the ground, but as I said earlier today, put wingtips and pumps on the ground on the feet of foreign service officers who know the languages, know the region, know the history, know the culture. Have the Secretary of State camp out in the Middle East, shore up our alliances, which have deteriorated badly, have a president who will work the phones with regional leaders, something, again, that George Herbert Walker Bush did so brilliantly. This president does not do that, and he doesn't like his Secretary of State to actually take on major diplomatic initiatives in the region. So if we did too much in the last decade, I would argue we're doing way too little now. And if you don't get it right in the Middle East, it has a way of biting you pretty hard. So we need to get back in the game. It's going to be a long year until we have a new administration. I don't expect this administration to do anything of consequence. They're just going to let it ride. That's what happens in the last year of an administration. And I hope we can ride it out. So I'll stop there and hope we can turn this into a bit of a dialogue. And that's all been pretty gloomy, I know. I will conclude on a note of what passes for me as optimism. As bad as things are today, and they're pretty bad, savor the moment. Enjoy it, because 3 months from now, you're going to look back on today with longing and nostalgia for the good old days, because 3 months from now, it's going to be way worse. Thank you very much.
Again, we'll invite you to ask questions. We'll go to about 8:30 if you'll, I think we have somebody coming up already. Do us a favor, if you would, just briefly identify yourself, ask a brief question in the form of a question as opposed to a speech, and then Ambassador Crocker will take it from there. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, Mr. Crocker. Andy, I'm an Arabic student here at BYU. There's been talk in the news lately of Libya. ISIS strength is growing exponentially. There's talk of maybe an intervention. I'm wondering your thoughts, what U.S. policy should be in Libya, and what you think will happen.
That's a great question. Lest I seem kind of flippantly hard on the last two administrations, let me just say this is really, really hard stuff. I mean, really hard. Take a look at, say, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. In Iraq, we invaded and we occupied, and it all went over the edge. In Libya, we invaded from the air, we didn't occupy, and it all went over the edge. In Syria, we neither invaded nor occupied, and it all went over the edge. So there's nothing easy about this stuff. Yes, the growth of Islamic State should scare us all. You may have seen the Director of National Intelligence, Director of Central Intelligence, saying day before yesterday that it's a question for them when, not if, Islamic State strikes in America. So what to do about it? I certainly wouldn't, again, send in the 82nd Airborne. The complexity of Libya right now is about equal to that of Syria. What I would do, again, is exert some U.S. leadership. Our regional friends are all engaged with different groups in Libya, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Turks, the Qataris. By and large, you've kind of got a coalition of Qatari and Turkish-backed militias fighting a group of Saudi and Emirati-backed militias. And this is what happens when the U.S. is absent. I would like to see us be present in the first instance, convening those countries who have a stake or an interest or an involvement in Libya and working to get everybody on the same page. You know, what threatens us? What can we do about it? Who can we do it with? The only country that can convene that kind of effort is us. So again, that's where I would start. I'd start by talking, and the Egyptians are in it too. I'd start by talking to, these are all our friends, or were until we started ignoring them. They are all imperfect, they all have different agendas, but in a region rampant with disorder, they stand for order, and order is what we need to back. And as we approach complex problems, we can't do it unilaterally. We can't do it just with the Europeans. We've got to work with the regional players. So that's where I would start in Libya.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Crocker. My name is Luca, and I'm a journalism major. And we have a very large amount of ROTC students and a massive amount of BYU students that want to go into public service. And you have been in like we've emphasized many times, some of the most turbulent areas of the world. What advice do you have for BYU students that want to go into this kind of service and are going to have to get down deep into the darkness at times?
Yeah, it's a great question, and again, it's why I'm so happy to be here, because that is the kind of university BYU is. Yeah, go to hard places and do hard things, whether it's abroad or at home. You're BYU students, so you already know this. The value of life actually isn't measured by the number of trips to the mall. It's going out where you're way outside your comfort zone, in places doing things that can make a difference for our well-being, for our security, for the world's security. There are many different avenues to that. As Fred remarked, I was an English lit major, philosophy minor in college. That kind of teaches you how to think and think creatively. Journalism is a terrific background if you're interested in the Foreign Service. So this is a time to start thinking about, how and where you want to serve, because that is a hallmark of BYU. And again, I hope you and your colleagues will take a look at the Foreign Service. It's a really, really hard service. It's a very small one, but it is intensely rewarding. When you hear about something bad happening somewhere in the world, there is going to be an American embassy at ground zero trying to figure out how to manage whatever has just broken loose. So think about that. Think of all the ways you can serve. I had a chance to meet with the ROTC heads today, and Brigham Young has a tremendous military tradition, which is pretty widely known. What isn't widely known is that you have produced a lot of Foreign Service officers who, as I mentioned, in the case of my 3 ambassadorial colleagues, have done and are doing great things for their country in very tough places. So thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Colton. I'm a psychology major here at BYU. My question is similar, but what can we, those who aren't going into public service, what can we do as individuals to help with the situation going on?
There are so many ways to make a difference. One of the great things about America is our spirit of volunteerism. I did a program Tuesday at A&M with the head of an organization called Global Volunteers. These are people who volunteer in sort of 18 countries around the world. They've been doing this since the mid-1980s. Some of them are physicians. Some of them are people who just want to go pound nails and build houses. So, as you establish yourself in areas other than public service, go into business, for example, think about ways you can volunteer. If not overseas, in your own communities. One of the hot button issues now, of course, are refugees. I have a clear bias. I'm on the board of Mercy Corps International, and we do very extensive work with refugees, and I just phoned in to do an interview in Dallas on refugee resettlement. Refugee resettlement in this country, and prior to the Syrian crisis, no country settled more refugees than we did from all over the world. It's all done by volunteer organizations. You have groups like International Rescue Committee that kind of set an agenda for community resettlement, but the actual work they do through volunteer organizations, many of them faith-based. You know, and whatever some of us may be saying now, this is a nation of immigrants and refugees. You know, and unless your forebears were around to greet the Mayflower or were brought here in chains, all the rest of us are immigrants or refugees. That's what America is. So there's a tremendous amount of good you can do in a community working with refugees. And although we're going through a bad patch right now, as Churchill said of us, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. We will do the right thing eventually on refugees as well, and that's just one example of a way you can make a real difference, whatever your actual profession is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Crocker. My name's Taylor Shippen. I'm a political science and economics student here at BYU. Tonight we've talked a lot about governments, but I wanted to go towards the problem and challenge of religion. Recently, I was watching a lecture at the Brookings Institute, and Jonathan Sachs said that one of his greatest fears about the Middle East is that within the different Abrahamic faiths, there are voices asking for moderation and tolerance within some of the faiths, but that he didn't hear moderate voices strongly condemning some of the violent acts that were going on from Muslim quarters. Do you agree with his assessment? Why or why not?
I don't know when this was. About 2 weeks ago, some 350 Muslim clerics and scholars from all over the Islamic world met in Morocco for a 3-day conference on extremism and moderation. And they issued a call for moderation with a lot of specifics in it, that it is the duty of Muslim majority societies to protect and ensure the well-being of religious minorities within that society. You know, so it went well beyond just a call for moderation, but to say there is a duty for Muslims to look after those of the minority religions. This did not get a lot of splash. Where's my journalism major? Yeah, get out there and cover that story. It's, but it was a very significant conference. You know, what impact will it have? That remains to be seen, but it is a reminder that there are a lot of voices out there calling for a very different approach than that brought to us by Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, and frankly risking their lives to do it. So maybe this was before, the lecture you heard may have been before the conference, I don't know, but we're seeing it. Well, it's happening. We may not always see it.
Thank you.
My question for you deals with ideological extremism, but not in the Middle East, in America, because we increasingly kind of see really, really polarized politics, and it can make it difficult to be well-informed about issues like the Middle East and issues that can be controversial and very divisive. And so my question for you is, how do we understand what's going on politically and in foreign affairs especially, when everyone is so divided and it's so difficult to get news and things like that without such flagrant bias?
Yeah, there are two really good questions in that. In terms of the polarization, kind of watching the primaries, it's scary. But I remember another time when America was highly polarized, and that was at the end of the Reagan administration. And the immediate cause was Reagan's Central American policies. This was the time of IranContra, if you remember, and the accusations we were supporting death squads in El Salvador. The split on Capitol Hill between Democrats and Republicans over our Central American policy was almost as sharp as the splits today between the two parties. When Bush 41 was elected, named Baker as Secretary of State, Baker's first mission wasn't to the Middle East or to NATO, it was to Capitol Hill. First week he was in office, and his message was, this is not Reagan 3, this is Bush 1, and we're going to do things differently. One of the things he did was to appoint Bernie Aronson, a lifelong Democrat, as Assistant Secretary of State for American Republic Affairs, i.e. Central America and South America. Clear signal, the policy was going to be different. And by about May of that first year, boy, it was different. And we actually got the Sandinistas out of office by getting them to accept the outcome of an election. That paved the way for core bipartisan support for the really big challenges that came later in the administration, the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because Baker and Bush had made their first priority here at home, knitting up the partisan divide, the country as a unit could approach these really big crises. So the next president, whoever he or she is, really has the same imperative to make the first mission trying to re-knit the partisan divide. It was done under very tough circumstances then. It can be done now. It's essential that it can be done. How do you know what's going on? It's kind of hard. The world has never been more complicated. The end of the Cold War at least brought a certain kind of stasis of terror. You didn't have all the volatility that you do now. But at a time when it's harder than ever to understand the world, our ability to understand it has never been less. Good luck with that journalism career, because the core of foreign correspondence is probably 10% of what it was when I was in Beirut on my first tour in the early 80s. Only the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times still have foreign bureaus out there. Everything you get on CNN, that's parachute journalism, if that. Somebody reading a wire story about a place they've never heard of and then giving you some comment they just made up. And that's as true on Fox as it is on MSNBC. It's just a different comment. So how do you get at it? Follow the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. They have got, both of them have first-class foreign correspondence. You can ignore the editorial pages. They cancel each other out in any case. How many of the students in this room, or any of you in this room, how many of you watch Vice News? Yeah, okay. Everybody under 30 at least knows what it is if they don't watch it. Nobody over 30 has ever heard of it. Vice News is carried on HBO. They do really great reporting on the Middle East. Doesn't have a particular slant, but they embed their journalists. I saw one clip, sort of a 15-minute special on Ramadi, just before it fell to the Islamic State. And, They had a journalist, an Arabic-speaking journalist, in the governor's office as Islamic State rockets were bouncing off the roof. And they're filming the governor on the phone to Baghdad saying, "We can't hold out much longer. Will the Americans come? If the Americans don't come, we're lost." And of course, the Americans didn't come and they were lost. But Vice does this kind of reporting, and they're the only ones out there in the States who do it. So, get that on your channel list, along with the major papers.
Thank you.
I'm reminded of an experience I think that might be relevant here. When I served in the U.S. Embassy in Saudi Arabia, when you spoke of Secretary Baker making that effort to get up to Capitol Hill that way, when I was in Riyadh, the Secretary of Defense serving Democratic President Clinton was a Republican senator from Maine by the name of William Cohen. And Senator Secretary Cohen, twice a year, every year that I was there, in the spring and in the fall, came to the Gulf as Secretary of Defense, paid his visits all the way up and down the Gulf. There was a conversation earlier this evening, we were talking about, well, when you say intervention, do you mean military intervention? Do you mean diplomatic intervention? Well, our instinct when you hear intervention and when you heard the questions, the first thing that came to your mind, they meant military intervention. But that's, if you'll take the analogy, Secretary Cohen was doing his home teaching. Just stop and think about it. He was getting there on a monthly basis, making that kind of contact that only person-to-person contact in that part of the world, that kind of difference that person-person contact can make over there. Anyway, it does make a difference, the people who serve us and who lead us. I've been looking forward to this all day. I asked one of our serving ambassadors, graduate of BYU, to share some thoughts about Ryan Crocker. And we'll close tonight with these observations. And for those of us who are students here, it's not really embarrassing, but it is a kind of personal and very real compliment to Ambassador Crocker. But the challenge to you is to think of yourself as being this kind of person. I come from a generation of Foreign Service officers that looked to Ryan Crocker as the model of analytical temperament. Now just think of what you've heard tonight and how you heard it. Passion for the art and craft of diplomacy. Stamina, courage, and toughness. In his office, you would expect to see Metallica posters on the wall, not Ferrero Rocher chocolates on the table. Those of us who sought the opportunity to work for him loved the fact that he confounded the dull stereotypes that some have of diplomats. If you wanted challenge in the sense that you were making the world a better place for the United States, you wanted to work for Ryan Crocker. As a young desk officer on the Egypt desk in the Department of State when Ryan was serving as the chief of Embassy Cairo's political section, I had my first opportunity to work close to him. Across my own career, I worked for him again in Kuwait, in the department in the tough months leading up to the decision to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and in Embassy Baghdad during the period 2007 to 2008 as he steered U.S. policy, and listen to this is a beautiful metaphor, as he steered U.S. policy in a manner that made me think of the early Polynesian navigators that could see things in the subtle movements of wave and wind that no one else could see. It was humbling and thrilling. He gained tremendous respect from presidents and secretaries of state, left the institution of the U.S. Foreign Service stronger as a result of his career, and has continued in retirement to work passionately in support of the profession of diplomacy in the country he represented so superbly. Matthew H. Tueller, U.S. Ambassador to Yemen.